The first time he saw the house, it was raining. The kind of rain that makes everything look older than it is, soft, silver, endless. The for sale sign leaned sideways, half swallowed by the grass. Behind it stood a two-story Victorian with flaking paint, sagging shutters, and a porch that seemed to sigh under its own weight. He should have driven past. Most people did. But something about the house held his gaze. Something quiet, patient, and strangely familiar. He parked at the curb and sat for a while, listening to the rain against the windshield. The house stood still as though waiting for him. When he first stepped inside, the air was colder than outside. It smelled faintly of dust and something older, a scent like old paper and forgotten flowers. The floors creaked, the wallpaper curled at the edges, and a clock on the mantel ticked though no one had wound it. The real estate agent, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gestured toward the staircase and said, "The upper floor was closed off for a while. The previous owner wasn't in good health. But it's all yours now." He asked how long it had been empty. "About 8 years," she said. "He passed away. Had no family that anyone could find." The man nodded, barely listening. His eyes wandered through the dim light that filtered through lace curtains. He imagined what the house might look like with warmth again, with lamps, curtains drawn, wood polished, air moving through the rooms. He bought it 3 days later. For weeks he worked alone. He stripped old wallpaper, sanded floors, replaced broken glass. Every morning he brewed coffee and walked from room to room, notebook in hand, making quiet plans, what to repair, what to keep, what to leave untouched. There was a calm in the solitude. The house seemed to settle around him, its wooden bones growing less hostile. At night he sometimes thought he heard faint movements, like a sigh through the pipes or the soft crackle of old wood adjusting to temperature. He told himself it was nothing. Old houses breathe, that's all. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway upstairs, he noticed something odd. The corridor had 3 doors, one to the master bedroom, one to a small guest room, and one that led to a linen closet. But the measurements didn't add up. From the outside, the house's structure suggested another small room, one that didn't exist inside. He measured the distance between the windows, counted steps from one end to the other. The math was wrong. Somewhere space was missing. He went downstairs and found the original blueprint rolled up in a drawer. It was yellowed and fragile, the edges torn. And there, faint but clear, was a 4th room drawn behind the master bedroom. No label, no door. Just an enclosed square. A sealed space. He returned upstairs. In the corner of the master bedroom, behind a heavy wardrobe, the wallpaper looked slightly different, newer, smoother. He moved the wardrobe aside, heart steady but curious. There it was, a narrow seam along the wall and a faint rectangular outline. He pressed his ear to the surface and heard only silence. He tapped. Hollow. He leaned closer, noticing a thin crack near the baseboard, and beneath it, something metallic. He fetched a flashlight and knelt down. Hidden under layers of paint and plaster was a small, rusted keyhole. But no key. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the old house groan in the dark, the rain tracing paths down the window. His thoughts circled back to that hidden door, the one no one mentioned, the one sealed by time itself. Who had closed it? Why? And what could be inside? He tried to tell himself it was nothing more than storage. A forgotten closet, a boarded-up utility space. Yet something about it refused to let him rest. The next morning, he returned with a small chisel and hammer. The first strike echoed sharply through the quiet. Bits of plaster crumbled away, revealing more of the wooden frame. The air smelled stale, untouched for years. He worked carefully, patient as though performing an excavation. Beneath the plaster, a door emerged. Narrow, wooden, painted over many times. It had a brass handle and that small rusted keyhole staring like an eye. He tried the handle. It didn't move. He stepped back, breathing in the dust. Something about the stillness of the room unnerved him. He could hear his own heartbeat. He thought of the man who had lived here before, an old recluse whose name he'd read once in the property record but forgotten. He wondered if the man had locked something away intentionally. He almost stopped then. Almost. But curiosity is a quiet hunger. It doesn't shout. It whispers. He went to town, found a locksmith willing to make an old-fashioned skeleton key, and returned that evening. The sun was setting when the key turned. The sound was soft, a click followed by a deep mechanical sigh. He hesitated for a long moment before pushing the door inward. The smell hit first, air heavy with dust and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. He raised the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small room. A single chair sat by the window. The curtains were drawn. On the floor lay an open book, pages yellowed with age. Beside it, a photograph in a silver frame faced the wall. He turned it over. A young woman smiled up at him, standing in front of the very same house, sunlight in her hair. He looked around again. The walls were bare except for faint discoloration where pictures once hung. The furniture was simple, untouched. A small writing desk stood against the far wall. His drawer was locked. He searched for a key but found none. Only dust, silence, and the faint feeling that he had entered someone's memory uninvited. That night, he sat at the kitchen table staring at the photograph. Something about the woman's face stirred a feeling he couldn't name. Not recognition exactly, but something close to it. A sense of loss or longing, like remembering a dream he never lived. He placed the photograph on the counter and turned off the light, but even in the dark he could see her smile. He dreamed of rain again, of the house before it decayed, with voices echoing in the halls and piano music faint in the distance. In the dream, the locked room was open, and someone was sitting by the window, writing in a book. When he woke, the air felt colder. Days passed. He tried to focus on repairs, but the house seemed different now, less still, more aware. Doors he'd left ajar were found closed. The clock on the mantel, silent for weeks, began to tick again. He told himself it was coincidence. But at night, he could almost sense another presence in the rooms. Not hostile, not ghostly, but waiting. He finally returned to the locked drawer. He used the same chisel to pry it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and a notebook bound in faded leather. The first page carried a name, written in delicate cursive. It matched the woman from the photograph. He read the first lines by the dim afternoon light. If someone finds this, please understand. I stayed because I couldn't leave. Not after what happened. The handwriting trembled slightly, as if written through tears. He turned the page. They told me to forget, to start over. But how can I, when every room remembers? He closed the book and leaned back. The house was utterly silent, as if listening. He looked again at the photograph, the woman's eyes bright with life that no longer existed. Somewhere beneath the sadness of that image was a story waiting to be told. Not of ghosts or hauntings, but of someone who had once loved deeply and lost more than she could bear. And now her story was inside these walls, waiting to be found. He didn't know it yet, but unlocking that room had opened something else. A truth that would change the way he saw not only the house, but the life that had once filled it. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it waits, patient, silent, for someone kind enough to listen. For days after finding the notebook, he could think of little else. He would wake early, make coffee, and sit by the kitchen window turning the fragile pages, trying to piece together the life of a woman he'd never met, yet somehow felt he had always known. Her handwriting began neatly, full of grace and restraint. But as the entries went on, the letters wavered, growing hurried and uneven, as though her thoughts had begun to outrun her calm. Most entries were dated between 1971 and 1975. She wrote about mornings spent by that same upstairs window, about her husband, unnamed but often mentioned, who had once filled this house with laughter. She wrote of silence creeping in after a tragedy neither of them could bear to name. And she wrote of the room. He says to close it, to seal it up so we can start again. But the walls remember. They always will. He paused, reading those words over and over, tracing the indentations her pen had left. The writing stopped abruptly one winter, with a final line written in darker ink. If he comes back, tell him I forgave him. No signature, no date, just silence. The man closed the notebook and stared out the window. The rain had returned, faint and constant, the same as the day he first saw the house. He wondered who he was, and whether he ever came back. The next morning, he drove to the local library. The building was small, tucked between a post office and a bakery, the kind of place where time moved slowly. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with sharp memory, smiled when he mentioned the address. That old place, she said. Haven't heard about it in years. Belonged to the Larkins, I think. He nodded, the name ringing faintly familiar. It must have been in the old property deed. She led him to a section of archived newspapers. He spent hours flipping through brittle pages, eyes burning from dust and small print. Then, in an issue dated February 1972, he found it. A short article. Barely a few paragraphs. Local family tragedy. Child dies in accident. He read it twice. A 5-year-old boy, the only child of a couple living on the east end of town, had wandered out during a storm and drowned near the old quarry pond. His mother was found later that night searching in the rain, refusing to believe he was gone. No names were printed, but the address was the same. His hands trembled as he folded the page. Back at the house, the silence felt heavier. He climbed the stairs, entered the locked room again, and sat in the chair by the window. The light through the curtain was dim, filtered through dust. He imagined the woman sitting here, maybe every day, looking out at the same gray sky, waiting for a sound that would never come. He picked up the photograph again. The smile she wore must have been from before the tragedy, before grief had settled like a shadow in the corners of this house. On the desk, beneath where the letters had been, he noticed a faint rectangular mark, the outline of something once pressed there for years. Perhaps a second photograph. He wondered where it had gone. The next few days blurred into quiet investigation. He combed through Old Town records, found a birth certificate for a boy named Thomas Larkin, dated 1967. The mother's name matched the one in the notebook. The father's name was Charles. There were no other family records after 1975. No obituary for either parent. No sale notice. No sign of where they had gone. It was as if the family had simply vanished from the town's memory. One evening, as dusk bled into the windows, he explored the basement, a space he'd mostly avoided until now. The air was thick with dust. Light from the small window fell in pale strips across old boxes and tools. In the far corner, he found an old chest covered with a tarp. Inside were stacks of photographs, faded, curled at the edges. Most showed the family before the tragedy. The boy on a swing, the couple smiling at a picnic. Laughter caught mid-motion. But deeper in the pile, the photographs changed. The husband stood alone now, his face gaunt, eyes distant. The curtains in the windows behind him were drawn. And then, the last photo, the woman again sitting by the upstairs window. Her gaze unfocused, her expression somewhere between sorrow and peace. He turned it over. Written on the back in the same hand as the notebook. He sealed the door today, said it was for the best. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. The image formed in his mind, a man trying to erase a memory too painful to face, closing a room to trap grief inside it, and a woman refusing to let go. He could almost hear them arguing in the hallway, the desperation in their voices. Not anger, but heartbreak. The house had absorbed it all. The next morning, he called the county records office. After a long pause, the clerk found something. The husband, Charles Larkin, was admitted to a hospital in 1976, she said. Long-term care. He was listed as widowed. The man's stomach turned cold. Widowed? He asked. There's no record of her death. The clerk hesitated. Not one that's official. But it says here he listed her as deceased when he was admitted. And he never came back? No, she said softly. He died there in 1984. That night, he sat in the dark living room, the old clock ticking faintly behind him. The story was forming now, but there were gaps, painful human gaps. The woman had lost her son. The husband, unable to bear her grief, sealed away the room where she'd spent her days. Perhaps she refused to leave it. Perhaps, in her sorrow, she stayed there until the silence claimed her. Maybe that was why the door had been locked. Not to hide her, but to keep her close. He couldn't sleep. The house seemed to breathe again, the floors settling softly as though shifting in its rest. He went upstairs. The locked room waited, unchanged. He turned on the small lamp by the desk and opened the notebook again, searching for something he might have missed. Near the end, written faintly in pencil, were a few words smudged almost beyond reading. He said he'll make the door disappear, but he doesn't understand. This room is the last place he saw him alive. The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap. The boy, the accident, the window. He looked to the side, toward the glass pane now coated in dust. Beyond it, through the branches, he could just make out the faint shimmer of water, the pond where the child had drowned, half a mile beyond the property line. This was the view she had watched every day. Waiting, he stood for a long time, staring out that window. The reflection of his face blurred against the glass, mingling with the ghost of her gaze, years apart but bound by the same grief that clung to this house. A gentle wind moved through the crack in the frame, carrying the scent of rain. He whispered softly, almost without realizing it, "You can rest now." The lamp flickered once, then steadied. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the house for the first time in weeks. Felt different, lighter somehow. He decided to restore the room, not erase it. He cleaned the dust from the furniture, rehung the photograph on the wall, and placed the notebook beside it. He didn't paint over the cracks or remove the marks of age. They were part of its memory. Later that afternoon, the librarian called him back. "I did some digging," she said. The husband, Charles, when he passed, the hospital noted he kept a silver locket by his bed. Inside was a small picture of a woman by a window. No one claimed it. He thanked her, then sat in silence. It was all the confirmation he needed. The locked room hadn't been about secrets. It had been about holding on to love, to guilt, to the last trace of what once was. That evening, he sat again in the chair by the window. The setting sun painted the room in soft gold. He thought of the woman and her son, of the husband who had sealed the door not out of cruelty, but because he couldn't bear to see her pain reflected every day. Grief had turned their love into silence, and silence had become their only way of staying together. But something in him felt changed, too. For years he had wandered through his own quiet life, moving from place to place, always searching for something unspoken. The house had chosen him for a reason, he thought. It needed someone who would listen, and maybe, in doing so, it had given him something back. A reminder that love, even buried in dust and time, never truly fades. That night, as he locked up the house, he noticed the clock on the mantel had stopped again. He smiled faintly, then whispered into the quiet, "Good night." The house didn't answer. It didn't need to. The story had finally been told. The rain returned on the morning he decided to leave. It fell in long, slanting lines across the porch, the same quiet rhythm that had greeted him the day he first saw the house. The yard shimmered with puddles. The for sale sign he'd taken down months ago now leaned again against the steps, freshly painted, waiting. He stood in the doorway for a long while, listening. The house had grown familiar. Every floorboard, every draft, every scent of aged wood and faded lavender. It no longer felt like a stranger's place. It felt lived in again, as though time had begun to move inside its walls once more. He'd spent weeks restoring what he could, repairing the windows, polishing the brass fixtures, bringing light to rooms that had sat in darkness for decades. Yet one room, the smallest, he had left untouched. The locked room. It wasn't locked anymore, but he never closed the door fully. It stayed half open, as if the air itself needed to breathe. Inside, everything remained as it was. The chair by the window, the notebook on the desk, the photograph restored to its frame and placed where the light could reach it. He walked there now, the sound of rain softening as he entered. The air was still cool, but no longer heavy. He sat in the same chair she had once sat in, looked out through the same glass she had watched for years. Beyond the window, the pond shimmered faintly through the mist, silvered and quiet. He thought of her, of the woman who had filled these walls with love and sorrow, who had written her heart into pages no one was meant to find. He thought of the man who had sealed this place not to hide her, but to hold on to her memory, to protect it from the outside world that kept moving when he could not. And now here he was, another man, drawn into the same house, feeling the same silence. But for him, it had become something different, peaceful, human, forgiving. In the weeks after his discoveries, word of the story had spread quietly through town. The librarian had helped him locate the graves. 2 modest stones in a small cemetery just outside the old district, half covered in ivy. The boy's marker read only a name and 2 dates. The mother's stone stood beside it, unmarked but recently cleaned, as if someone had tended it before him. The father's was missing entirely, no record of burial. He had brought flowers once. Not roses or lilies, just wildflowers he'd picked from the field behind the house. He didn't say anything aloud. Words felt unnecessary. When he left, the wind had shifted through the trees in a way that sounded almost like a sigh. Now, as rain pattered softly against the glass, he reached for the notebook on the desk. The cover was worn smooth from his hands, the edges faintly curled. He'd read it so many times he nearly knew the passages by heart. But there was one he always returned to, written early in her grief, before everything fell apart. Love doesn't end when someone is gone. It waits in the quiet corners, in the places they once stood, in the air that remembers their voice. You don't have to see them to feel that they're still here. He closed the book gently. The house had become that quiet corner, a vessel that remembered what others had forgotten. He rose from the chair and began to walk slowly through the house one last time. In the hallway, his footsteps echoed softly against the wood. He paused at the banister, tracing the curve of the rail polished smooth by hands long gone. He could almost imagine the boy running down those stairs, laughter trailing behind him, his mother calling after him with that familiar warmth captured in the old photographs. He smiled faintly, not with sadness but gratitude, for having known their story, even if only as a witness. Downstairs, the living room looked brighter than ever. The clock on the mantel had stopped again days ago. He decided not to wind it. Let it stay that way. Frozen in the quiet moment the house finally came to rest. He looked around one last time, at the empty teacup on the counter, the faint smell of old varnish, the light filtering through sheer curtains. It no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like memory itself, imperfect, tender, and true. He walked outside. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the kind that seems to cleanse rather than conceal. The yard glistened with new green shoots pushing through the soil. The house looked almost beautiful now, not because it was perfect, but because it finally seemed to belong to the world again. He leaned against his car and watched it for a while. When he'd first arrived, he thought he'd bought an empty house, something to fix, to fill with purpose. But now he understood that the house had been waiting not for an owner, but for acknowledgement. For someone to listen long enough to remember. Maybe that was what all places wanted in the end, not restoration but remembrance. He had listed the property quietly, without ceremony. There were already a few interested buyers. A young couple, an artist looking for space, a woman who said she loved houses with stories. He hadn't told any of them about the room. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because some stories speak for themselves. Whoever lived here next would feel it in time. The gentle hum beneath the floorboards, the way the sunlight lingered longer in certain rooms, the faint scent of dried lavender in the air. They'd never know every detail, but they'd sense it. That love once lived here, and that it had found its way to peace. That evening, before leaving for good, he went back inside one last time. The rain had stopped. The air smelled clean and new. He climbed the stairs and stood at the threshold of the small room. The fading light spilled across the floor, catching the edge of the silver picture frame. He picked it up, studying the woman's smile, timeless, unguarded. He whispered softly, "You're home now." Then he placed the photograph back on the desk, just as it had been when he found it. On an impulse, he took a blank page from his notebook, tore it free, and wrote a few words of his own. "I found your story. Thank you for trusting me with it." He folded the note and slipped it into the back of her journal. Then he closed the cover and set his hand on it for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of everything that had passed through this house. The sorrow, the forgiveness, the love that refused to die. He walked back through the hall, pausing halfway down the stairs. The setting sun caught the edges of the walls, turning the pale wallpaper to gold. Dust floated like glittering motes in the air. For the first time since moving in, he felt the house was watching him go. Not with longing, but gratitude. He smiled faintly, then whispered the same words he had spoken the night he unlocked the hidden door. "You can rest now." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break apart. Pale light glowed through the mist. He closed the front door gently behind him, turned the key in the lock, and slipped it into the envelope for the new owners. As he reached the car, he stopped once more and looked back. Through the upstairs window, the very one overlooking the pond, he thought he saw a flicker of light. Not movement exactly, just the reflection of sunset against the glass. But something about it felt alive, as if the room itself had taken a breath. He stood there until the light faded, the sound of distant thunder rolling softly over the horizon. On the drive away, he felt neither haunted nor burdened. Instead, he felt lighter, as if he'd left a part of himself behind in that house, and taken a part of it with him. He rolled down the window. The scent of rain lingered in the air. The fields on either side shimmered with water, reflecting the fading sky. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, as he passed the edge of town, he whispered a quiet goodbye, not to anyone in particular, but to the silence that had become a kind of companion. Weeks later, he received a letter forwarded from the real estate office. It was from the woman who had bought the house, the artist. She wrote simply, "I don't know if you ever felt it, but there's something special here. I found an old notebook upstairs. I didn't read much, just a few lines. It made me cry. I think whoever lived here before loved this place very much." He smiled, folding the letter carefully. Yes, he thought, they did. Years would pass before he saw the house again. He was driving through the area on a gray afternoon when he took a detour, just to see it. The paint was new, the windows open. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. The laughter of a young boy echoed faintly from the yard, a sound the house hadn't heard in decades. He stopped the car and listened, smiling through the drizzle. The rain had returned once more, soft and cleansing. And in that moment, he knew the house had finally healed. He sat there a while longer, watching as the lights inside flickered on, warm and alive. He thought of the woman in the photograph, the man who sealed the door, the boy who never grew up. Their story wasn't gone. It had simply changed form, folded into the wood, the walls, the rain that whispered against the glass. Love doesn't end. It just finds new ways to stay. He started the engine, glanced at the mirror one last time, and drove off into the fading light. Behind him, the house stood quietly against the rain, no longer waiting. It had been heard. It had been forgiven. And somewhere in that small upstairs room, a photograph watched over the world with a smile. Not of sorrow, but of peace.